Today in the EU, what it takes to halt mass tourism. Every summer, social media platforms are flooded with pictures of iconic European vacation hotspots. This year, the European Union is expected to welcome around 760 million tourists. That's about 70% of the whole European population. Some Europeans, especially those who reap the economic benefits, love it. Some have had enough. Like in Barcelona, where protesters sprayed water on tourists in early July. Even beyond Spain, mass tourism is causing uproar throughout the European Union. Rent prices are soaring, and so is the overall cost of living for many who used to enjoy once picturesque and unique places. And so, how can we address the major issue that mass tourism has become in the EU? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. To understand how the European Union is facing this problem, I'm joined in the studio by one of the most cited researchers in the field of tourism, Stefan Gössling. Hi, Stefan.
Hello.
First of all, let's clear the air. Where are you going on holiday this summer?
The funny thing is, I hardly ever go on holiday. I mostly work 365 days a year. But we have a farm in Sweden that I'm managing for 1 month in the summer. That is my holiday.
Yeah, Stefan, I see you're incredibly sustainable in your vacation plans, but that is not what the average tourist will do. Reason why we're talking about over-tourism today, an issue that deserves more and more attention. As an academic and researcher on the topic, when did you start tracking this phenomenon?
Oh, we obviously turned to over-tourism in 2018 when that was the major headline in literally all European newspapers. We had too many destinations being confronted with too many tourists. And that was also the starting point, I think, for a lot of the research that came interrupted very shortly after by the pandemic, if you remember. And now we are back at the point where we are discussing over-tourism.
Right. 2018 is also the year you co authored a policy paper by the European Parliament Committee on Transport and Tourism. Do you remember the key highlights of that? I think one of the first documents that we have on tourism policy making.
Yeah, it was an attempt to get a take on over tourism. Where is it happening? Where is it worse? Can we identify the pressure points that turn proponents of tourism into opponents? And all of that was part of this policy paper, which looked into different issues really that can contribute to perceptions of mass tourism becoming too dominant. And these can be social, environmental, they can be economic when the cost of living is going up for residents. There's a multitude of different issues that can become relevant in perceptions of over-tourism.
It is a dilemma because for many communities, tourism has been the primary or one of the primary sources of income. According to forecasts, travelers will spend more than 700 billion euros in Europe this year. However, the influx of tourism comes with plenty of costs, especially borne by local communities. Let's talk about the positive and negative impacts of the industry.
Initially, if you have tourism in a community, it's probably positive. Everybody likes the exchange with people. Everybody likes to see new people coming into a community who also show an interest in a community. And then there's many benefits associated with that. It's that local shops can generate more turnover, but it's also perhaps that you have a restaurant or a cafe that you wouldn't have without the tourists. So everything is very positive because the tourists bring the turnover, the additional money that allows many communities to have services that they couldn't afford otherwise. But then obviously we have many destinations in Europe where tourism has become too dominant because people have decided it's a very easy way of making money.
Yeah.
And then that has led to a dominance of tourism. If you think Venice, for instance, it's very hard to move in the city because it's always full with people. Its traffic has become an impossibility in many parts of Europe during the summer months in particular. And then you have associated health issues. There's pollution that becomes quite oppressive, specifically when it's hot and humid. There's these issues. And then obviously, at some point, you also have this perception of loss where you no longer control your environment where you have perhaps been growing up, and where all of a sudden, because you might have Airbnb as a business idea and you used to have a neighbor next to you, and all of a sudden you're in a situation where this neighbor is changing every day. You never know who might be your neighbor the next night. And that has become a problem because people then have felt these social effects that also have had economic consequences, because the profitability of a rental on Airbnb is much higher than a rental on the normal housing market. And that has pushed up prices for housing in many urban centers. So that is the main reason, I think, why people have become discontent with tourism development.
You've mentioned Airbnb, and some mayors around Europe have taken drastic measures against the platform. For instance, the mayor of Barcelona announced that starting in November 2028, the city will ban short-term rentals and will not renew licenses for tourist apartments. Is this the first time that we're seeing regulations on housing to halt mass tourism in Europe?
Yeah, well, obviously the issue here is that initially this Airbnb idea of renting out your flat when you're away was a very good one. I mean, it's empty, nobody's using it, it's you're gone for 3 weeks. Why not give it to someone who perhaps is a family, has difficulties finding a hotel room that has an appropriate size? It's a very good idea to start with.
Yeah.
And then obviously we have seen many people moving into this because it has become a business where the same flat is rented all year round. The problem with Airbnb is essentially that it refuses to hand out any data to local communities on how many clients they have, how many flats really are rented out all year round, and so on. And they aggressively try to prevent information being handed over to local governments, which makes it very difficult to even handle the situation, because if you have no data, how can you act on the facts?
Of course.
So that is something that is a huge concern now, because many communities have to employ people to go around and check on flats. Are they rented out all the time? Are they not? It makes it very difficult to create a positive living environment for residents. And I think that is one of the problems cities are grappling with. And I personally think Barcelona is showing the way, because we have to do something. For years, communities have not had a chance to, get transparency from Airbnb and others. And that has now led to this situation. And I think it's the only way to deal with the situation, unfortunately.
You've also researched quite extensively how to build a positive way ahead when it comes to making tourism sustainable. Which countries in Europe are leading the way in eco-friendly tourism activities?
I'm personally quite intrigued with Austria, because we have a positive movement in Austria towards becoming more sustainable. It starts with the ambitions in regard to climate change. Austria really has sought to not only have very ambitious national goals towards mitigation, but they have also established programs where all businesses and communities, most of all, can be part of what is called the climate and energy regions. And they get a little money handed out in order to implement sustainability on a broader scale in the community, with a focus on food, on waste, on transportation, all the issues that matter. And I think it's something that has generated almost kind of wave, where local people have come into this, understood that it's a positive development that they want to be part of, that they support. And that really has created a much needed movement towards more sustainable tourism, most of all in terms of avoiding the problems and fostering the local economy. And I think Austria is a very good example how to do it.
And outside of Austria?
There's others, obviously. I perhaps want to outline Turkey. Turkey has implemented a program where all hotels in the country need to become eco-certified. It's been mandated. And you might see that as a pressure point coming from the government, but we know from studies that these eco certifications are very useful for businesses because they start to understand where they're wasting,
right,
and how they can actually avoid that. And in most cases, it means that businesses will save money that is beyond what they have to spend for the certification. So I think this rollout of a national certification scheme that will involve, I think, 24,000 hotels is fantastic in terms of bringing everybody on board and creating the same level of ambition for everyone.
And so countries in the EU, as often happens, have differing interests, right? How do we move past the impasse?
It's first of all a question of difference, because not all countries in the European Union are at the same. If you think about Spain, a very ambitious tourism country with the different islands involved, of course, and tourism is very, very important in many of these regions. Spain is also very popular among Europeans for holiday making. So that is where we have seen a lot of the resistance recently, because certain trigger points now have been reached, levels have become unacceptable of tourism growth. And obviously, this is also a reflection on the pandemic, where people had time and opportunity to think how their communities would be like without that level of tourism. So that is something that is happening there. But then think about Eastern Europe, where you don't have much tourism in many countries at this point, where countries are hoping to generate more income through tourism. And you could argue that obviously there's much more room for development and much more opportunity for future growth in tourism.
It seems that there are local or national activities, a sort of movement going on, but not necessarily one at the European level. Or, well, I guess that's my question to you. Is the European Union doing enough when it comes to mass tourism?
I think in most countries, it's important that we get some kind of vision where we want to go. Very often we just develop things. We never think about where things might be going in 10 and 20 years. But this kind of reflection would be good for people to get a common understanding of what they want for their tourism systems in the future. We need a long-term vision. It's partially also embedded in laws. You know that we have the climate laws in Europe that force the European Union to reduce its emissions quite significantly. And tourism is a driver of emissions. We have, at the European Union level, a decline in economic sectors in emissions, but in tourism it's growing. And that's mostly because of air transport. We don't have solutions for air transport. Airlines are pretending that they have these solutions, when in reality we know they will not work or not work fast enough. And that is a headache that needs to be confronted, because we do know that there's many measures we can take in order to tackle both climate change and to create more sustainable tourism systems.
I can imagine that for an expert, it might be quite challenging to have all the answers, but what could be some policy responses?
It's not that challenging, really, but it takes a willingness to confront the facts. And I was invited to talk to the European Travel Commission in Lithuania maybe a month ago. And we did research into the national tourism organizations, because they are responsible for the marketing that individual countries are doing in the world. And we found that some countries in the European Union do a very limited marketing, involving just 6 target markets. Others have 33 target markets. Some have near target markets. Others have very distant target markets.
And why is this important?
Because the share of long-haul flights that we have is very small. We have only 17% of the flights coming into the European Union that is longer than 3,000 kilometers. But this small share of 17% of the flights is responsible for 62% of the emissions. So our suggestion here to the European Travel Commission was to simply stop marketing Europe in the long-haul markets, because they are the main headache when it comes to emissions and climate change. And I don't think it would make a big difference for countries if they did stop this marketing.
As things stand right now, a policy of this kind is not nearly in sight. How do you see things developing in the future?
We will see growth in tourism in the European Union, whether we want or not, simply because more people coming to the European Union from abroad is perceived as a safer destination in comparison to the rest of the world. It has many attractions, is very unique. So I'm not seeing any risk that the tourism system will lose. We should decide which kind of tourism we want, not that we want a volume that is just growing forever.
Thank you, Stefan.
Sure.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. We are going on holiday too. The podcast will be back on August 19. See you then. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.